So today I have the great pleasure, I'm always excited by all of our speakers, so we don't have, favorite children or anything. When your parents tell you they don't have a favorite, they do. So it just changes over time. So I'm very excited to welcome one of my favorite colleagues and collaborators. Dr. Ruiwei Jiang is an assistant professor in the IOE department here. He conducts research on the theory of stochastic and robust optimization, integer programming, their applications, looking in particular at power systems and healthcare operations. He is also, although he didn't put it on his bio, is helping to supervise PhD of Carmel Shahadi, who's working on patient scheduling in colonoscopy clinics. Ruiwei's research has been recognized with the very prestigious Informs George Nicholson Student Paper Award, the Stochastic Programming Society Student Paper Award, the Informs Junior Faculty Interest Group Paper Award, and we're very glad to have him with us here today. Thank you, Ruiwei.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Ruiwei Jiang. I'm from up street from the Beals Avenue. I'm very delighted to present this recent work together with Mr. Grill, who's somewhere in this room. On this joint work on nurse staffing under absenteeism. So I know only a little bit about healthcare. Like most of you, I'm still learning about healthcare operations, partially from Amy. But I know something about systems engineering, which turns out to be optimization methods, optimization models. So we are trying to look at how the optimization models, and in this talk, particularly about this concept of distributionally robust optimization, we want to see such a methodology can help us to understand better about nurse staffing. Or potentially, how can we understand better about how to make decisions on nurse staffing? Okay. So first of all, nurse staffing is significant. So the motivation slide. So if you look at this pie chart of how the budget is or the cost is are separated, it's broken down in different segments of hospital operation. We know that nurse staffing cost actually takes like 30% of that pie chart, which is significant. And for lots of reasons, because nurse staffing cost happens daily. Right? So on the daily basis, we have to pay nurses to show up for shifts, and this is not a one-time kind of setup cost we have to pay. This is actually the daily recurrent cost. So that's significant. On the other hand, nurse staffing is also very important for the safety of the patient, the quality of care. So for that purpose, actually, several government agencies, including California and then Victoria, Canada, they set up such a concept called nurse-to-patient ratio, and they kind of set it as a safe ratio, right? So one patient in my unit, I have to pair him or her with a certain number of nurses. So that's the concept of safe nurse-to-patient ratio, or NPR. Okay. So there are, in general, four phases of planning those nurse scheduling and operational problems. So shown in this timeline. Right. So months ahead, we kind of do this demand forecasting and then decide the staffing level. And the staffing level refers to basically integer number of nurses we are equipping for certain units. So weeks ahead, and taking the staffing decision as an input, we kind of schedule those nurses into different shifts. So we have the different type of shift: day shift, night shift, temp shifts. For nurses, we have to kind of breaking down those integer number. We come up with a staffing decision into a kind of a detailed schedule. Then, say hours ahead of the shift takes place, we have some pre-shift adjustment. And that typically relates to, say, one of my nurses doesn't show up. I have higher demand of nurses than expected. So for that, we have to do some restaffing and rescheduling. And restaffing could mean that we have to call in some temp nurses, right, in urgency, or I have to adjust the schedule of different nurses. Some nurses could work overtime. Some nurses some nurses are temp nurses, so they all work on contract. So those are the pre-shift restaffing and rescheduling decisions. I also had hours ahead of the shift takes place, we kind of adjust the previous 2 phases of decision that we have made. Okay. And of course, like typically minutes ahead, we do this nurse to patient assignment, meaning that we have to assign like nurses to like several particular patients to work with. Okay, so like 4 phases of nurse staffing according to the timeline. For our research, we focus on phases 1 and 3, and which means that we want to decide the staffing level, this integer number I'm equipping with each unit, and I'm also taking phase 3, number 3 into account, meaning that I know I could, my operation could subject to some uncertainty. I could have more patients or less patients than I expected. Some nurses might not show up. So I might have to do some restaffing decision, readjusting the number of nurses I'm equipping to each unit. Okay? And the output of our work could be taken as an input into making like a detailed schedule or like detailed nurse to patient assignment. And so our researchers focusing on phases 1 and 3, and the outputs could be used in the other 2 phases. Okay, good. So nurse staffing is challenging, and in this talk so as we argue, this challenge partially comes from the uncertainty that we have to get exposed to when making staffing decisions. Okay, so there are 2 main resources of uncertainties one might consider. One from the demand side, the other from the supply side. From demand side, that's kind of easy to understand. Of course, I always have random patient census. I don't really know how many patients will show up for my units. That's kind of the exogenous source of uncertainty. The other source of uncertainty comes from supply, and I'm going to call it the endogenous uncertainty. And the difference in between exogenous and endogenous uncertainty is that if you look at supply side, the random number of nurses that could show up for the shift actually depends on the decision I'm making. And the reason is that typically nurses do not show up due to like work-related stresses. That could create some vicious cycle like this. Okay? So we assign some number of nurses to certain units for a certain shift. So some of them come absent for their shift. That actually decreases the number of nurses remaining in a unit. And so the workload for the remaining number of nurses actually increase. Right? So they actually are getting exposed to more work-related stress, which actually encourage them to be absent to some future shifts they are assigned. And this cycle just repeats itself, and that encourages more and more the so-called phenomenon of nurse absenteeism. Right? So it's actually a kind of this cycling behavior. And due to this dependency in between nurse absenteeism and the staffing level of nurse, actually this this supply side uncertainty of nurses depends on the staffing level I'm deciding, right? And that's actually called the endogenous uncertainty, meaning that those random variable actually depends on the decision you make. So depending on how many nurses you are assigned to this unit, those nurses will have different probability of showing up or different probability of being absent from their shift. So this is very different from the first source of uncertainty, which is the demand of nurse, which actually doesn't depend on the staffing level. Right? So it more depends on like how patients are randomly coming into a unit, and that's independent of the decision. Okay, so to address these 2 types of uncertainty, there are typically 2 types of strategies proposed by hospital. The first one is always our last resort, that we can call in temp nurses or contract nurses, to make up this safe NPR, like nurse to patient ratio. The second potential solution, which is also proposed in the hospital, is to design such a flow pool of nurses. And what does it mean? It means that on top of those units of hospital, we are kind of grouping several units, a subset of units together to form a pool. And the example could be like this. Right? Suppose that I have 4 units, then I could group all of them together to form a pool. Then when making the staffing decision, I not only schedule nurses or staff nurses to each like regular units, I also staff nurses to this pool I designed. Right? And by doing that, in the phase number 3 of nurse planning, if I'm aware of any variance in my unit, either nurses not showing up or a higher or lower number of patients showing up, I can adaptively assign those pool nurses into each unit if needed. Okay?
But if not needed, you have extra nurses.
Yes. So if the number of pool nurses are still not sufficient to make up for any NPR balance, then we could call in like temp or contract nurses to make them.
Or if there are no shows, like there are no shows, like everybody shows up, then these pool nurses are extra.
Yes, they will be extra. So we couldn't send nurses back home like off their regular shifts. Yeah. So this is example number 2 about how pools can be constructed, right? So I still have 4 units. Maybe I can group the first unit together and the last 2 units together to form 2 pools. And the pool structure actually refers to how those units are pulled together to form pools. And they do make some difference. Clinically, different units should require different set of expertise from the nurses. Right? So maybe operationally it is not possible to group 4 units together, or maybe we can only group certain units together to form a pool. But in this research, we are trying to understand this problem from an operational perspective. So supposing that we don't have those clinical barrier of forming pools, how should we, from an operational perspective, form the pool or design those pool structure potentially in an optimal manner? Okay, so more on pool structure. So as I said, we could, in phase number 3, assign pool nurses into each unit adaptively after learning how many patients show up in the units and learning which nurses are not showing up for their shifts. Okay, and naturally that could increase the operational flexibility, reduce the number of temp nurses we might need. Right? And so that could lead to higher quality of care or lower nurse staffing costs. And I would like to highlight the second benefit here. Reducing the number of temp nurses will not only maybe reduce the total nurse staffing cost, it typically could also lead to higher quality of care because temp nurses might not be very familiar with the situation in each unit. So the hospitals typically tend to like temp nurses or contract nurses less than those regular nurses or pool units or pool nurses that they can use. Okay? Right? And of course, together with this pool structure design, there comes this concept called cross-training. As I said, different units will probably need different skill sets, and so in order to equip this particular pool nurse to work in both Unit 1 and Unit 2, we have to cross-train such nurses so that he or she is qualified for working in both Unit 1 and Unit 2. Right? And question?
How big of a problem is nurse absenteeism?
Yeah, so I will show this statistic later, but in general, that's somewhere in between 5% to 20%. Yeah, so that I'm talking about the probability of not showing up. Right? So some very brief literature review. The majority of literature on nurse staffing focus on deterministic models, meaning that we want to ignore those 2 uncertainties I just mentioned, demand uncertainty, absenteeism uncertainty, we just forget about them. And naturally that leads to some underestimate of the total staffing cost, because in reality we do have uncertainties affecting our operation, and from time to time we have to call in temp nurses that increase the actual staffing cost. For stochastic models, the majority focus on this so-called exogenous uncertainty, meaning that we only model the demand uncertainty while ignoring the absenteeism behavior. And according to this literature, forward by Green et al., that results in understaffing. If we do like to incorporate this absenteeism, this endogenous uncertainty into consideration, so as I will explain later on, that actually results in computationally prohibitive model. So we cannot really solve such model in a plausible way with certain guarantee. For that reason, a lot of literature just use heuristics, meaning that we just come up with some, maybe policy-based approach that could search among certain solution. And but unfortunately, such heuristics typically lead to a solution without any guarantee either. Okay, and this is an explanation why endogenous uncertainty could be challenging to deal with computationally. Okay, so by definition, endogenous uncertainty means that the probability of a nurse not showing up for their shift partially depends on the decision you make, which is the staffing level. So imagine that you come up with some staffing level on one hand and observe the corresponding probability of not showing up. Then you might say, okay, so they have this probability of not showing up. How about I make a decision according to this particular probability distribution? So if we come up and make an even potentially better decision and try implementing it, we find out that, okay, this uncertainty is actually depending on my decision. So when I now change my staffing level, that probability will change as well. Right? It's always like you are trying to catch a running agile fox. Right? So as you move, that fox moves as well. And so it's very hard to do this capturing strategy accordingly. Question?
But how strong is the linkage? The stronger the linkage, the harder your problem.
Yes, the linkage is shown in this empirical research component of that paper, Green et al. So that shows by using a data-driven an empirical research approach, they kind of summarize that the probability of each nurse not showing up for their shift depending on this function and with this particular dependence on number of nurses you schedule. So with 5 nurses equal for units, the not showing up probability is 12 nurses. And if we increase that that staffing level, of course that probability could drop. Right? But that also comes with this recurrent cost of staffing more nurses on a daily basis.
So nurses think that if there are few nurses scheduled, things are gonna be tougher, more difficult. So it's easier not to show up. That's what they think.
Yes. So this is what this paper found out. They kind of analyzed several potential factors of encouraging nurses to not show up for the units. They find out that out of all the factors, the work-related stress actually plays the most important role. Yeah, and that's why they kind of proposed this model of probability of not showing up actually depends on the number of nurses we staff for that particular unit, and that curve is actually decreasing as the number of nurses increase. Okay. Other questions? So as I said, that's the challenge of modeling such endogenous uncertainty. And of course, the heuristic approach will be this learn and optimize, right? So I kind of optimize my staffing level. I learn the probability distribution according to this particular decision I make. Then I come back to adjust my decision. If I do this kind of iteratively, maybe at the end of the day, I will be able to convert to some good decision. Okay, so unfortunately, again, due to Green et al., this reference 4, that approach also leads to understaffing. Right, so another potential workaround, which was proposed by 4, is this parametric model they use to model this endogenous uncertainty. Okay, so they come up with this parametric model by assuming that every nurse will independently choose to not show up for their shift, and their absence probability are homogeneous, meaning that everybody is showing up independently with the same probability. Okay? And by using that, they will be able to derive a closed-form solution if they are only need to staff one unit, one particular unit in a hospital, relying on this understanding on the not showing up probability. Okay, so of course that brings this question of how can we generalize or extend such an approach to deal with a more realistic setting in which we have multiple units and potentially we have multiple pools representing different subset of those units. And also a more basic question we want to ask is that what if this chosen parametric model is biased? Right? So as I said, they assume all the nurses show up independent with the same probability. What if this assumption fails? And we actually have very good reason of believing that this assumption might fail in practice. It's near the Thanksgiving hospital, the Thanksgiving holiday. People tend to, I mean, if I'm a nurse, I tend to put my leaves during the Thanksgiving holidays. Right? So that indicates that people might choose to not show up for their shift in a dependent way instead of independent. Okay, so what's our proposal to address such a potential mitigation? We come up with this non-parametric model, meaning that we want to waive such assumption of independence not showing up and homogeneous probability. Okay, so with that, we propose this so-called distributionally robust approach. And the building block of this approach is that we want to consider a family of probability distribution instead of a single one, assuming independence and homogeneity. So basically, we want to build up certain membership criteria. We want to check every single probability distribution to see if this probability distribution is plausible in this particular application. If it is plausible, then I collect it into this family of probability distribution. If it is not, then I exclude them. Right? And at the end of the day, I would have a family of them, right? Instead of only a single one. And how do I design such a membership criteria? I use this so-called moment-based criteria. And so accordingly, we call this family of probability distribution the moment-based ambiguity set. Okay, so in this set, I'm collecting all probability distribution that fit the following criteria. The first criteria is the moments of the nurse demands. Okay, so I'm saying that this distribution will be a part of my ambiguity set if it fits my understanding on the mean value, variance value, skewness, occurrences, so on and so forth. So it fits certain moments I have in mind about the nurse demand. Right? And this could be done in a certain data-driven fashion. Because if I look at the patient census data, if I keep them in my registry, then I can kind of evaluate the empirical mean, variance, so on and so forth. Can evaluate those moments of nurse demand, and by using them, I can filter those potential probability distribution. Okay. The second criteria I'm using is about the endogenous uncertainty. So in particular, I'm fitting the mean value of the number of nurses who show up for their shifts. I'm saying, empirically, we will be able to infer this mean value from the staffing level I decide. Okay? So if we keep the historical record of how many nurses I staff for this unit versus how many of them actually show up eventually, then we can actually use a similar empirical approach to tell how this random variable is deciding on my decision. Okay? So I'm particularly using these two criteria, both based on moments, in order to construct a set of probability distribution. Okay? And then I'm going to describe this distribution robust optimization model in a slide later. That will be applied in this more general setting containing multiple units and multiple pools. And at the end of the day, we'll be able to represent or recast such a DRO model as a single mixed integer linear program. Okay, so if you are not very familiar with MILP, you only need to know that this is an optimization problem that can be solved by commercial solvers within hours. Okay, so with reasonable size of instances we tested, actually those MILP we came across with could be solved in a very short amount of time, so down to seconds. And then based on such a model, we will be extending it to design the optimal pool structures. So how should we form up? How should we group the units together to form pools? Okay, so those are the outlines that's quickly going into this so-called distribution robust nurse staffing model, DRNS. So in this model, we are making two decisions, staffing decisions. The first decision is WJ, the number of nurses assigned to unit J. We're going to call such nurses the regular nurses, right? So they are the nurses who kind of commits to this particular unit. They are kind of regular. The other decision variable is YI, the number of nurses assigned to pool I. So remember, we have multiple pools. We need to decide how many nurses we are assigning to those pools. And for them, we are going to call them like pool nurses. Okay? So WJYI, number of regular nurses and pool nurses. No big deal. Right? So this is the mathematical model. It contains three parts in the objective function. So we are minimizing the total expected cost of staffing. It contains three terms. The first term is like this linear function of WJ. This is the total cost of staffing regular nurses. Right? Second term, similarly, this is the total cost of staffing pool nurses. And the third term, it takes a kind of a more complicated form. So I'm going to define this value function V of W, Y, and eta as the total cost of staffing temporary nurses or contract nurses. Okay? And why it has to take such a complicated form? Because this cost of staffing temp nurses actually depends on the random number of patients that show up in my units. It will also depend on the random number of nurses show up for this regular unit and the pool. So that's why we put the tilde on these three variables, W tilde, Y tilde, and A tilde. That's because they are all random. Right? So the cost of my temp nurses partially depends on what's the realization of those three random variables that I will be able to observe. And at the end of the day, I'm going to consider the expected value of such random cost of staffing temp nurses. Okay? And on top of that, I'm going to hedge against the worst case expected value of such B function. And why worst case? Because now I don't just consider one particular probability distribution. As I said before, we actually have a family of probability distribution. Right? So with regard to which distribution are we talking about this expected value, we are actually hedged against the worst case one, the probability distribution within this ambiguity set D that is going to give me the largest value, the largest possible expected cost of staffing temp nurses. Okay? So that's why we say we are minimizing the worst case expected staffing cost. Okay? The worst case comes from that SUP part. Because I'm going to choose one distribution within this family I construct to maximize my staffing cost. And accordingly, we are making the staffing decision WJ and YI to hedge against such worst case staffing cost. Okay? Question?
So if a nurse doesn't show up as a hospital, do I still pay the salary?
Yes. Yes. So because typically those nurses not show up for their shift is using their days off. So within a year, 365 days, they have certain amount of days, typically around 20 number of days that they can flexibly allocate within the year to apply for a day off. Yeah. So for those scenarios, they still will receive their regular salary, but for the hospital operation, they can view it as a temp, like nurse absenteeism in earnest. Other questions? Right. So this is how I construct this so-called ambiguity set based on moments. So as I said, the nurse demand uncertainty eta tilde, we kind of feed match their moments. So and we allowed any arbitrary number of moments up to Q orders to match. And for the nurse absenteeism, we are saying we are matching those probability distribution such that the expected value of W tilde will be this given function of my staffing level WJ. Okay? So this is actually how the endogenous uncertainty is going to relying on the decision I make. So mean being a function of Wj. And similarly, the expected value of y tilde will be a function of the decision yi I make. Right? So in general, those fj and gi function should be piecewise linear function, and that's because both wj and yi should be integer values. So for whatever function you might feed, they can always be recast as a piecewise linear function. Okay? So our approach do allow such a reliance on piecewise linear functions, but for simplicity, for this talk, let's just assume that both f and g are linear. Right? So, and intuitively, you can understand that you can interpret it as a kind of a fixed probability of not showing up for each single nurse, and show for that case the expected value of wj will be just that rate of not showing up multiplied with the number of nurses I step. Okay, and this is how we model this total cost of staffing temp nurses. Right? So this happens in phase number 3 of our nurse planning. So we can actually model such, we can actually compute this cost of temp nurses by solving this minimizing integer programming problem. Okay? And it looks complicated, but let me try explaining how it works. Right? So taking this for example, suppose that we have 4 units, we group the first 2 units to form pool 1, the last 2 units to form pool 2. So in phase number 3, we're going to learn how many nurses actually show up for both pool and those 4 units. So suppose that I have this y1, y2, and w1, 2, 3, 4 to represent the number of nurses who actually show up for their shift. The next step, since I'm having some pool nurses, I will be able to kind of reassign those pool nurses into each unit in their pool in order to make up the safe NPR. Okay? And those are related to those Vij variables in this integer programming problem. And of course, if we are still needing some nurses to make up the safe NPR in some units, we can always call in this temp nurses represented by that blue xj variable. And if I have, say, in some cases, some extra number of nurses, then those are represented by ej variables on the right by the green arrow. Right? So this IP problem looks complicated, but at the end of the day, this is just like that, a network flow problem. Okay? So if you know something about network flow problem, you might still remember that in a network flow problem, we have such desirable property called total unimodularity. Okay? And this is the what's going on over here. This IP problem is actually enjoying this TU property, totally unimodular, and that's why we can actually rewrite this as an LP and take the due. Right? After taking the due, we can rewrite this recourse problem, this like V value function, as the optimal value of a linear programming problem. Okay? With alpha and beta representing the due variable, and living in this due feasible region lambda. This lambda is actually a polyhedron. Okay, so I apologize for this slide. It's way too mathematical than we need. It's just prepared for those of you who are interested in. Sorry? Oh no, I'm not doing this. Yes, I am, partially. But I'm also preparing this slide for those of you who are interested in maximizing a convex function over a polyhedron. Right? If you understand this sentence, it is also prepared for you. Right? So the baseline point over here is that this problem is actually challenging, and this is a building block for our DRL model. So in order to solve the proposed optimization model, we really need to maximize such a function f of alpha beta. Alpha and beta, as I introduced, is the due variable of my due problem. And it lives in the polyhedron feasible region, which we denoted by lambda. And we want to maximize such f function over these 2 continuous variables, alpha and beta. Okay? And that objective function looks like this. This is a convex function in alpha and beta. Okay? Don't question me. I know. Okay? So naturally, maximizing a convex function over a polytope is challenging. So if we want to do that, a nature tool will be resort to the integer programming literature and then try and come up with an IP model with big M coefficients. Right? So if you know big M coefficient, you know that it is difficult to deal with computationally. So what we do differently here is that we actually analyze that underlying polyhedral feasible region lambda, and we try using binary encoding all of its extreme points by using a set of auxiliary binary variables. So what we did is that we actually enumerate those exponentially many extreme points of this polyhedron, and then we use binary variable to represent each single extreme point. If we're able to do that, we'll be able to rewrite this convex maximization problem as an IP model without using big M coefficient. So that's the benefit of analyzing the extreme point of the polytope, and with that, we'll be able to solve the IP subproblem in a more efficient form. Okay. All right. So those are the. So even better, if we consider some special structure of how we how we design the pools. So the things could be even easier, as easy as solving a one-stage monolithic MILP model. So at the end of the day, we just solve one single MILP, then we'll be able to decide on the staffing level under this endogenous uncertainty. Okay, so these are the three particular pool structure we consider. The first one is called one pool, so all the units belong to the one single pool. The second is called disjoint pool, so basically those pools are governing a subset of units that do not overlap with each other. The third pool is the so-called train pool. Okay, so this is the very popular in the process flexibility literature. We would explain that in detail later. So for this three special pool structure, we'll be able to solve the problem much more efficiently as a monolithic MILP model. So the first two structures, one pool, disjoint pool, we realized that that underlying integer set is actually totally multiple. So if we relax that integrality restriction, we still get a convex hull, and then we'll be able to solve the LP. Okay, for the train pool, so how it is formed up? Train pool means that you will always group two neighboring units together to form a pool. Right? So if you have 5 units in this case, you will be grouping the first 2 units together to form the first pool, units 2 and 3 to form the second pool, and so on and so forth. Right? At the end of the day, you want to group unit 5 and unit 1 together to form the last pool. Okay? So in this final structure, we find out that the LP relaxation for that underlying integer set is not exactly the same as its convex hull, but nevertheless, we will be able to rewrite that IP subproblem by using 2 longest path problem on an acyclic directed graph. So this is also polynomially solved. Okay. So yeah, so we just came back from this long mathematical walk. Now let's look at the high level of this model again. So we did some computational tests on the model we came up. We'd kind of solve this 6-unit staffing problem, and then under this 2 different pool structure. Under the first pool structure, in which we have like disjoint pool, the total staffing cost is like $15,000, for which we have like 3 pair of cross training, because we are pairing units 1, 4 together, 2, 5 together, 3 and 6 together. So we only need to cross train like 3 sets of nurses. Okay? So 3 cross training. While compared with the second pool structure, in which we have a much more complicated cross training structure. Of course, we are kind of pooling the last 4 units, units 2, 3, 5, and 6 together. We will have exactly the same staffing cost, but with way more number of cross training that we need to do. Okay? So this motivates us to consider actually optimize this pool structure design. So how can we come up with maybe a sparse pooled structure, but have a strong guarantee on the staffing cost? And this is what we will be able to do based on the DRO model, in which we introduce this additional binary variable, Yij, to represent that we are grouping units I and j together within the same pool. and we are minimizing the total number of the cross-training, which is basically the summation for all those Yij's. And we add an additional cost, saying that we want a guarantee on the staffing cost. Right? So we want our expected staffing cost to be lower than a certain level, while we minimize that total number of cross-training. Right? So by solving such a problem, we'll be able to say, okay, so if your budget of staffing cost is at this level, then at least you need this number of cross-training. And this model is going to tell you like which units you should pull together and do cross-training. Okay? So this is what this OMPD model does, optimizing the pool structure design. Okay, so some computational results. First, we want to show you the computational performance of actually, going the long way, analyzing the extreme point of the polyhedron, doing this and that, and we want to show you like what does it bias, right? Okay, so for that we kind of conduct the following multiple test instances comparison. So by not using our analysis and using this so-called two-stage approach, you can observe those CPU seconds we are using in the second and fifth column. So in some large-scale instances, actually we are running out of time. So within 1 hour CPU's time limits, we wouldn't be able to solve those problems to global optimality. If we do the hard work, if we do those boring maths, then we end up with this MILP model, which we could solve typically within 2 seconds. So that's the benefits of doing those boring maths. It actually saves in terms of carbon footprint. Right? So we wouldn't need to use that many CPU seconds. Okay. So second, we kind of did a small example in which we look at this 4 units with 1 single pool structure, and then output some nurse staffing decision. So as you can see in the middle table, our optimal nurse staffing decision is that W1 to 3 taken some positive numbers, right? So 6, 7, and 7, meaning that we are staffing corresponding number of nurses to these 4 regular units. And the final notation, Y1, is the number of nurses we are staffed for the pool, for the 1 single pool. In this case, we find out that that number is actually 0, meaning that optimally we actually don't need any pool nurses. We just assign like nurses to their regular units. That's optimal. Right? We don't need any pool. Right? So that kind of leads us to the following question: when should we actually need such flow pools? Maybe in many circumstances we actually don't need such a flow pool of nurses. Why we bother to solve such problem and staff them in the first place? Right? So to understand that better, we kind of run the following experiment. So there are 3 inputs for the instances we run. The first input, TCR, indicates how expensive a temp nurses will cost us. Right? So that's the cost of hiring a temp nurses versus the cost of hiring a regular nurse. Typically, that number should be greater than 1, but if temp nurses is way more expensive than a regular nurse, TCR could be very high. The second input is PCR, the relative cost of hiring a pool nurse, and the third input is AR, so the relative absenteeism rates of a pool nurse. Right? So if we assign a pool nurse to a pool and then he or she will always show up, then AR will be 0. And with the 3 inputs, we look at this single output, which we call the value of forming flow pools. So that's the relative difference in between forming 0 number of pools versus putting all the units in 1 single pool. And so that's the kind of the value of flexibility that forming a flow pool can bring into this nurse staffing problem. Okay, and here's the result. So on the z-axis, we are showing you this value of flow pool. On the x and y axis, there's like 2 inputs. AR representing the absenteeism rates, and PCR represents the relative cost of hiring pool nurse. Okay? So the higher the curve, the higher the surface is, the more valuable to form a nurse pool. Right? As you can see, the highest point happens when AR is 0, meaning that the nurse pool will always show up, and when PCR is 1, meaning that it is equally expensive to hire a pool nurse versus hiring a regular nurse. Right? So that save of a cost could be as high as like over 20%. Right? So the value of hiring, the value of forming nurse pool could be as high as 20% if the pool nurses tend to show up less frequently, and if hiring such pool nurses is less expensive. Okay, so we repeat such experiment under different TCR value, and they all look similar. So the intuition is that hiring pool nurses will benefit when the following three things happen. When the temp nurses are like more expensive to hire, when the pool nurses are relatively less expensive to hire, and when the pool nurses show up more frequently than they do when assigned to regular units. Okay. All right. So this next question we ask is why should we bother to model endogeneity? Right, so you tell me that ignoring absenteeism will lead to understaff, but how costly would that be? Okay, so for that we kind of do this simulation, out-of-sample simulation, comparing two decisions. The first decision is the optimal solution of our model. The second decision is the counterpart that everything is the same, but ignore the absenteeism of nurses. For that, we kind of draw. Compare their out-of-sample performance in terms of staffing costs. In here we have this red line representing the case that two costs actually agree with each other. So with or without considering absenteeism, we are having the same staffing cost. But as you can see, like almost all the points are for below that line, meaning that with the nurse absenteeism considered, we actually can save in terms of out-of-sample staffing costs. And the magnitude of such saving actually is proportional to this OVG percentage. If you still remember OVG, that actually is the value of forming flow pools. So the higher the OVG value you get from the model, actually the more you could save in this out-of-sample simulation. So somehow, this in-sample performance of our model and out-of-sample performance actually agree with each other. Right? So the higher the power our model is in terms of paper, the higher it will be in the out-of-sample simulation. Okay, so in here we do we compare various pool structures and compare their optimal nurse staffing decision. So we consider this non-nurse pool, one nurse pool, disjoint nurse pool, trained nurse pool, and this final column represents this optimal way of forming up nurse pools. Right. So please only look at the last two columns, which represents the performance, the optimal solution of trained pool versus the optimal design pool. So if you look at it, you see a different breakdown of number of nurses into either regular units or nurse pools, and if you look into it more closely, you find out that in the trained pool, actually we have in total 21 cross training, while we assign many nurses into those pools, as compared to this optimal pool design model, we actually only have 2 cross training. And we cross-train units 5 and 7 and 4 and 6 respectively. We are assigning those number of pool nurses into this only 2 pools. Okay, so their out-of-sample performance, the out-of-sample performance of these 2 optimal solutions are actually the same. So by using optimal pool design, they actually give us something. We are having the same guarantee in terms of staffing cost, while we have way less number of cross-train. Okay, so finally we want to understand which units should we pull together. So we have various type of units. Which ones should we pull together in the optimal solution? Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to the last page and directly give you the understanding that we have from our test. So we conduct 3 type of tests, and the conclusion is that it seems that we should pull together those units with higher uncertainty. And this higher uncertainty is especially with regard to absenteeism. So we should pool those units with higher absenteeism together to form the pool. And that intuition show up significantly in the optimal solution of our test. The intuition is that if we pool, say, 2 units, both with high absenteeism together, then the flexibility brought by designing such a pool will most efficiently reduce the variability from the original model. So, yeah, so that's why we think that it's actually optimal to pool those units with higher uncertainty, especially higher absenteeism together to form a nurse pool. Okay, so I will end here. And thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know.
So you said you didn't use any clinical stuff in the model because, but like, wouldn't just kind of like a discussion, wouldn't like clinical decision making even improve the model because you could reduce cross training even less of certain clinical specialties because of the units? So like you don't only have 2 cross training, you could reduce that if certain absentee problems to come up. No, never mind. I'm just talking about myself.
No, so as I said, this research is only want to understand this nurse staffing problem from an operational point of view. So we are not actually looking at different clinical requirements in terms of which nurse should I assign to which units, and which units shouldn't be pulled together. We just want to come up with some insights from purely operational perspective, something like this. Right? So it brings us some intuitive understanding.
So is this based on basically a hypothetical analysis, or did you actually go to a particular setting and get the results from there? Is it hypothetical analysis?
So with those examples, the data come from the Yale hospital.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
in terms of that absenteeism curve, where does that come from? Linda's paper?
Yes, from Linda's paper. Yes.
Do
So
you have a sense of how reliable that is? Can it be transferred to other settings?
I'm actually not sure.
Yeah, okay.
But I want to say that our model is actually less sensitive to the data than theirs, because our ambiguity set is based on group statistics instead of modeling one single unit at a time. So it's like the total number of nurses who show up depending on total number of nurses staffed. It's not modeling the no-show behavior of each single nurse.
Okay.
Is there anything in the literature on teamwork affected by like,
Teamwork affected by pooling. Yes. So I'm exposed to very few literature of that, but even in this subset of nurse staffing literature, there are such literature, like talking about the improvement of quality of care if you do cross training, for example.
What's the intuition why we would pull pools which have higher absenteeism rate?
Yeah, good question. Our understanding is that it could, so by pooling different units together, that could collectively reduce the level of variability brought by the absenteeism, for example.
Yeah, but you said the units with high uncertainty are grouped together, right? So that's
Yes. So by grouping them,
it makes sense. But at the beginning, I would, if you ask me without thinking anything, I would say pull groups with high uncertainty with low ones, so that overall it's going to be better or something. But then actually you're pulling together with the high uncertainties.
yes. So as we understand, that's so because we can. That's so because the rate of improvement in terms of reducing the variability. So consider like how fast you can reduce the level of variability by forming by grouping units together. If you group together high uncertainty with high uncertainty, the improvement in terms of reducing the variability is the most.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the.
Were you expecting that result without before your experiments, or you?
No, totally not. we should double check with Minso. I think he didn't expect that either. Question?
Oh,
Yes, sorry, I have a lazy eye. This is my not lazy eye.
Okay, that's okay. So did you consider like different costs for different pairs of cross training? Like if certain pairs are more difficult to cross train versus.
Actually, in this model, no, because in here we didn't actually model that fixed cost of cross training. We simply minimize the total number of cross training.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, but of course, if you have such data of how costly this cross training in between two particular units would be, that could be incorporated into this objective function. Yeah.
So let us thank our speaker again.
Thank you.